hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 73 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you for joining me here on this, once again, rainy Tuesday in New York. If you're checking out episode 73 on the YouTube channel, you're enjoying the content, haven't done so already, don't forget to click like, subscribe, turn on the notifications. Or if you're listening on one of the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes and you're enjoying the content, click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. So today is Gene Hackman's 94th birthday. He has been completely retired from the movie business for 2 decades. His last movie, oddly enough, was a film with Everybody Loves Raymond, Ray Romano, called Welcome to Mooseport, where I believe he plays the mayor of a town called Mooseport. I didn't bother with it. The reviews were terrible. And I like Ray Romano as a kind of personality, but I never got into his program. I know it was very popular, but I never really watched Everybody Loves Raymond. But Gene Hackman is almost an unquestioned great. You can find movies of his, and he's kind of joked about it over the years. No, he retired from acting, but he didn't retire from life, although he was never a big Hollywood guy as far as the glitz and the press. And he did press tours for his movies, but he wasn't a guy who was seeking the spotlight for himself. He was always very quiet and private when not working, a little bit like Harrison Ford in that way, where Ford was just as happy to be at his ranch if he wasn't, trotting the globe shooting movies. Hackman wrote some books after he retired, some of which were apparently quite good. I haven't read any of them. And he still lives in a ranch, this amazing rustic ranch farm type home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which I believe he purchased in the 80s. And Will Smith, when he worked with Gene in fantastic 90s thriller, Enemy of the State, at a certain point they were shooting not far from Gene's home, and he invited his, would you like to see my house? And Will had seen pictures and he jumped at the chance. And he was so impressed by what he saw that he hired the same individual's last name is Samuelson, who designed Gene's home, even though he bought it not new, he bought it used, but then he kind of retrofitted and rebuilt from there. And Will's mansion, which I don't know if he's still there, but that was built at least 20 years ago. It had certain similarities with what Gene did with his own home. So he's still active from what I can gather. He looks old, but he's 93, 94 now today. But the last pictures I saw of him in public, he was getting food at Wendy's, filling up his truck with gas, and he was doing a little work in his yard, just like a regular schmegular guy. You wouldn't know if you didn't know it was him. You'd say, wow, this is a hell of a nice house. This guy must have done something, pretty big. But he really doesn't make very many public appearances. Occasionally, he'll grant an interview, like when there was a 50-year retrospective on the French Connection, which ended up with Gene winning the first of his 2 acting Oscars, that one for Best Actor. He did give interviews, and he talked about some of the things that they were able to do in that film, some of the dangerous stunts that he pulled along with the filmmaker recently passed, William Friedkin, who of course did the original Exorcist. But Hackman got kind of a late start to acting. He spent, and I didn't know this is something that I was kind of informed of, he spent 4.5 years in the military. And he was stationed in China. He was sort of what they would call a radio operator. I actually have a friend who was a radio operator in the military. But Hackman is one of those performers who always feels authentic. It never feels as if he's just an actor. Number one, never feels like he's just an actor picking up a paycheck. And it never sounds as if he's reading from a script. And it's strange because there are people who sound unrehearsed, and there are people who sound as if they're reading from a script. But Hackman somehow always hit the middle ground of that. And it's one of the things that makes him so unique and distinctive among even his great contemporaries, peers. He's a little bit older than Clint, and he and Clint have had a friendship going back decades and, having worked together a few times. And, Gene kind of his career was, and it's almost amazing to think of it in these terms, but when Clint asked him to appear in Unforgiven at some point in early 1991, Gene was more or less on the A-list. Like, he was headlining movies that were hits at the box office. And Clint's career had kind of fallen a little bit, that he sort of, I hate to say hit the skids, that's a stretch. But Clint's career appeared to be lurching to, if not an end, but that he was no longer going to be able to get his projects funded through Warner. He was going to have to, maybe do different things. But when Clint approached Gene about starring in William Money Killings, what became Unforgiven, Gene was overjoyed. And he kind of even talked about at a certain point in his career, he just wanted to do Westerns. But Hackman got his first Oscar nomination for a movie which at the time was very polarizing, Bonnie and Clyde, which was Arthur Penn's classic 1967 film, which, in a smaller way than later movies or earlier movies like Psycho and later movies like Jaws, it changed the movie business, but only insofar as it was a changing of the guard of film criticism. And this is something that I did not know until being in film schools. I tell you, there aren't that many moments where I give you information that I probably wouldn't have gleaned without being in the film program at New York University. But that's one of those things, because this is not something that back then or now you could necessarily find in a book or on the internet. But there was an old guard of film criticism. And here's a great name to Google, Bosley Crowther. Bosley Crowther was like the patriarch of film criticism well into the 1960s. And even to a lesser extent, Pauline Kael, who had been doing it for a while. But the old guard of film critics hated Bonnie and Clyde. They found it to be disgusting. It was graphic violence. The Bosley Crowthers of the world not only hated Bonnie and Clyde, they hated Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch. Not the same year, but in the same ballpark. I think The Wild Bunch was 68. But that was a rare film where an actor, in this case Warren Beatty, who was the star of the film, going to bat for his movie and basically saying, critics are wrong. How about somebody else give this film another look? Because I think we knocked this out of the park. Beatty took a risk. Normally, when an actor complains about critics, Sylvester Stallone, I watched the Stallone documentary a month or so ago, and early in his career, he let himself get overly frustrated over some negative critical reviews for some of his earlier movies like FIST, and he was pissed off, and he almost was offering to fight film critics. Like, really? Beatty took a shot. Beatty was a young man himself, younger than Gene. He was in his early 30s. And he basically was asking for Bonnie and Clyde to be reappraised. And it was. And the old guard of film critics, they just kind of fell by the wayside. And Bonnie and Clyde is now understood to be a kind of pioneering, trailblazing, groundbreaking film in a lot of ways. And Gene was nominated, it was very early in his career, even though, as I say, he was older than Beatty, who already had been a star for many years, at least close to a decade by that point. Gene was nominated for supporting actor, and there were a lot of people who thought he could win, but unfortunately ran into a buzzsaw, Cool Hand Luke and George Kennedy, who, if we're being honest, George Kennedy had a media role in Cool Hand Luke opposite Paul Newman, yet another Paul Newman role where he very easily could have won a Best Actor and did not win a Best Actor. But Hackman, there's the authenticity, but then there's having the eye for material, not taking any project that crosses your desk. Anthony Hopkins, who everybody loves, he jokes around about, hey, if the money is right, I'll take it. That's not really true. Anthony Hopkins has turned down a ton of terrible shit. Yes, he had a stretch, he worked with Chris Rock, where he wanted to do movies that might connect with Gen Xers, for example. But Hackman seemed to know what would play for a really long time. And I don't believe he's ever given a bad performance. Even a just atrocious, and I'll never forget this movie, Loose Cannons, a movie that he made with Dom DeLuise and Dan Aykroyd. It should have been good, the subject matter was so fucking stupid. It was about the search for a porno movie starring Hitler. And the thing with the movie was everybody who has seen this film is dead, and you guys came into contact with it, and now you're going to die. It was such an idiotic concept. But you see, Aykroyd's terrible. I love Dan Aykroyd, but his performance is complete ridicularity. And Dom DeLuise is just picking up a paycheck. Now, DeLuise, he was always funny. Like, he gets a few laughs just because he's Dom DeLuise. But even in this ridiculous movie, you see the gears turning. Hackman's trying desperately to make it work. And then later, after his kind of great period in the 90s, where he was in one blockbuster after another and gave one great performance after another, winning another Oscar with Clint in Unforgiven for supporting as Sheriff Bill Daggett, the man who to the very end thinks he's the good guy. This isn't fair. I'm building a house. Not very well. You're a shitty carpenter on top of being a lousy sheriff. But Gene made a movie in, I want to say 2001-ish with Sigourney Weaver and Jennifer Love Hewitt called Heartbreakers. It was sort of a dark comedy. Ray Liotta was in it. And even in that movie, he's playing a totally ridiculous, absurd character. But you still see him. He's given it what he's got. He's not phoning it in. He's always engaged. And to me, his last great performance, movie that one of my dad, may he rest in peace, the huge movie fan, Alan Philip Cohen. My dad read John Grisham's Runaway Jury. Dad was a big Grisham guy. Like, he was a little bit ahead of the curve with Grisham. He read The Firm way before the movie when it came out in the summer of 91. It was one of the few kind of oversized hardcover books. Dad didn't really buy hardcover, but that was one time where there was an FOMO. 1991 version of FOMO was everybody was reading The Firm. Everybody was reading The Firm. Dad read it. And of course, Gene ended up in the movie version with Tom Cruise of The Firm. But Runaway Jury the book was about, if I'm not mistaken, it was a smoking case. And the movie made it about a gun case. And normally when you make that kind of a change from book to film, you're going to have a lot of people saying, what the fuck? But there had already been, they already did the movie The Insider, which was a true story, the one with Al Pacino, Russell Crowe, Michael Mann, much lauded, critically acclaimed. It's one of Russell's best performances for sure. The time they made Runaway Jury, the movie wouldn't have worked if it was about smoking. So they made it a movie about a terrible gun death and can you sue gun manufacturers and all this kind of stuff. And the on-screen pairing of the two old friends who had studied together at drama school, and each guy was thought to be, and this is another thing you can Google, with the worst in the class. And I think that the joke was, it wasn't a joke then, but it's like ridiculous, a joke now, that Hackman was voted second least likely to succeed, and the least likely to succeed was Dustin Hoffman. So in Runaway Jury, Hoffman plays a prosecuting or plaintiff attorney on the side of, well, it's more or less Rachel Weisz and John Cusack's character, even though Cusack's on the jury. There's a whole lot of jury tampering in the movie, but we understand what's going on. But Hackman plays a jury consultant for the bad guys, so to speak, the defense. And he tears it up. He is like a human volcano in this movie. He's all rage and all vitriol and doesn't give a fuck. He's getting paid a lot of money and he doesn't care who dies. He doesn't care, well, this person got shot. Give a shit. Don't you lecture me. He almost does the old Richard Widmark. Don't wave the flag at me, boy. Don't you lecture me. And there's a scene in a men's room between the two multiple Oscar-winning acting titans. And Gene, of course, is a much bigger man than Dustin. But the two guys basically have what amounts to a verbal brawl. And neither one gives an inch. And the thing with Dustin in this movie, he's very clever. Because Hoffman is so talented. He's such a resourceful actor. He always knows what tools to bring to a fight. in this case, a verbal duel with a fellow, acting titan and an old longtime friend of his. They'd been friends for more than almost 35 years at the time. The scene between these two guys is worth the price of admission of the movie alone. But the film is a terrific thriller. There's a lot of misdirection, and we don't know what Cusack is doing, and Rachel Weisz, and who is she working for. It's terrific. But Hackman was nominated for 5 Oscars total. He was up for Mississippi Burning, The Year of Rain Man. Oscar won by his buddy, who I was just talking about, Dustin Hoffman. And so many great roles and performances. Like, there are movies that for some people would be considered under the radar. Hoosiers, for example. Now, there are plenty of people, movie fans, when I say people in this instance, who have Hoosiers as their favorite sports movie of all time. I like it. It's okay. My issue with Hoosiers is that I don't think it's the greatest sports movie, although I've seen it at least 10 times. It's really good, but Chariots of Fire, it is not. Rudy, I would say, it is not. Raging Bull, it is not. Rocky, it is not. Hell, Field of Dreams, it is not. The Natural, it is not. Rounders, if we're going to put Rounders in the category of sports films, which technically I think it has to be considered because it does follow the Rocky formula. That being said, Hoosiers is a terrific film. And I believe Gene was nominated for lead actor for that movie, but you know what? I might be wrong about that. It's not that important. He didn't win is what is important. And also my other problem with Hoosiers is that they nominated Dennis Hopper for supporting actor for the wrong movie, because Hoosiers was also the year of Blue Velvet. And as much as I appreciate what Hopper, who struggled with substance abuse for huge chunks of his life, what he does in the role of Shooter, the character that he plays, he's the father, brilliant basketball mind, but unfortunately an alcoholic. And what he does in Hoosiers, I appreciate it. It's as straightforward a performance as the usually wacky Dennis Hopper had given in his career. But what he did in Blue Velvet, Hopper was incredible. And they nominated him for the wrong film. And so maybe Hoosiers makes my top 10 best sports films, maybe not. As I say, I can always sit and watch it. It's very well acted. Barbara Hershey is terrific. Chelsea Ross, a kind of under the radar 80s and 90s actor. He's great as one of the people in town that really don't like Coach Dale, the character that Hackman plays. But Gene always made an impression. And Superman, the Christopher Reeve films, I don't know if he was in Superman 3. If he was, it was a throwaway. He wasn't the lead villain. But Gene in Superman 1, 2, and 4. Superman 4 is terrible. And I love Christopher Reeve. Still can't accept what happened to him. That in his early 40s, his life was basically over because of a riding accident of all things. A fluke. People get thrown from their horses. It's a risk. But normally you get bumps and bruises. He was thrown and he just happened to land at the worst possible angle. But there are a lot of comic book purists, and I'm not making any judgment. This is more of I'm just laying out the reality for you, that don't like and never liked. They might like Gene Hackman as an actor, but they never liked his sort of broadly comic interpretation of Lex Luthor. As somebody that never read a Superman comic, I thought he was great. Superman, the movie, 1978, was I think it was the third film I ever saw in theaters. My parents took me to see it. I loved everything about that movie. I believed a man could fly. And I believed that man, who I didn't know at the time, his name was Gene Hackman, as far as I knew, that was Lex Luthor. It's fucking brilliant, especially in the sequel, in Superman 2, whether the Donner cut or the Richard Lester sort of mishmash, which is still an incredible film. I would argue still a top 5 superhero movie. It's so good, even with some of the, kind of practical special effects not really working the way they would now. But Lex in that movie, the way that Hackman plays him, he's just amazing. Because his character in that movie is not a primary, secondary, or even tertiary villain. The villains are the Kryptonian 3. You will bow down before me, Jor-El, you and one day your heirs. Which a lot of people to this day watching that movie think that Terrence Stamp screams, "You will bow down before me, you and one day your ass." Because he almost said, "You and one day your ass." he might be saying your ass, but whatever. But Lex Luthor in Superman 2 is almost like a wild card character where he doesn't want the Kryptonian villains to destroy Earth because that would then kill him, and he can't really trust them. So if there's a way for him to somehow nail them with kryptonite that he could then leverage against Superman, whatever it is, he's always working angles because Lex Luthor, greatest criminal mind of our age, he's always working the angles. And Hackman, even though he had issues during that production because he loved Richard Donner, and when the Salkins basically gave Donner the middle finger and Donner had to exit the project, Hackman didn't even want to come back and finish. He was so pissed off. But if you just look at his performance in Superman 2, he is amazing. And without spoiling it, for people who haven't seen it, highly recommend, even if you're partial to the Henry Cavill films, so say you're under 30, watch the Christopher Reeve, number 1 and number 2. They are fantastic, even if some of the special effects are dated. They're amazing. And Hackman is so good. You know, Christopher Reeve was a kid. He was a young guy, 25, a theater, a Juilliard-trained theater performer. And Hackman literally lifted him up. He made his performance that much better just by being there, by not winking at the audience that this is a comic book movie, ha ha ha. Yes, he's funny, but the smile comes with deadly intent, and Gene sells it. He's fantastic in both of those films, if you ask me. Now, he made, as I say, a number of movies in the 90s where he gave indelible... I like Mississippi Burning. Again, as I say, one of his Oscar nominations. It's a good movie, and Willem Dafoe is terrific, and the filmmaker is Sir Alan Parker, one of my favorites. Sir Alan Parker's movie before Mississippi Burning was Angel Heart, which I would argue was a better film, but how can you compare one to another? Mississippi Burning is kind of a dramatic thriller, and this is a thriller, but to call them both thrillers, that's a little bit of a... Yeah, they're thrillers, but in a totally different realm. But Hackman, after the kind of disaster of Loose Cannons, he just made so many good movies in the 90s. Even a kind of lesser effort. The movie he did with Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, Class Action, it was mismarketed and mispromoted as a courtroom thriller. It's not. It's more of a malpractice, like a civil action, Erin Brockovich. It's not as good as either of those, but it's more in that ballpark. And the movie was promoted as a thriller. And I remember people in my 11th grade class were saying, it's bullshit. They acted like it was a thriller because there's a scene in the thriller, there's a scene in the preview where Gene Hackman, as only he can, in as threatening a way as he can muster. And, Mary Elizabeth plays his daughter and they're squaring off in a court case. Well, I wouldn't want to be at Thanksgiving this year, like that kind of thing. But Hackman faces down a guy at the end of the trailer and says, if you ever come near my daughter, they won't be able to identify you through dental records. And that's how the trailer ended. And it feels like a thriller. It's not. It's a straightforward drama. He did do an interesting, a remake of a 50s thriller, Narrow Margin, he did with Ann Archer, and a terrific James B. Sicking, who at the time was playing Doogie Howser's dad on Doogie Howser MD, which was at the time a very successful ABC sitcom with the always amazing, adore the guy, Neil Patrick Harris. So Hackman then, as I say, did Unforgiven, and then he did The Firm, the other Grisham adaptation, but it was before Runaway Jury. And there's an interesting little trivia note that you can, again, I always say you can Google it, you can check it out for yourself, because I don't like, as you know, I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to this stuff, and I don't like giving you bad information. But Gene Hackman does not appear in the credits of The Firm, the movie version, even though he is essentially the second lead behind the star, who is Tom Cruise as Mitchell McDear, the star of John Grisham's fantastic novel. I will still say that that is Grisham's best book. What an amazing read. Like, it wasn't an accident that everybody was reading that book in the summer of 1991, even me, a kid who normally didn't read, as I say, large print hardcover books. But man, what a great read. Amazing description. And, Grisham, as a former attorney, I know it's a cliche, but he understood the ins and outs of law firms, and I didn't know shit about this stuff, but he wrote in a way that a 17-year-old kid could follow easily what he was talking about. So Gene, I think because Hackman normally had it in his contract at that time that his name would be above the titles, and when they didn't do that because it was Tom Cruise, it was going to be Cruise's name above the title, Hackman was still making his money. They didn't underpay him. But I think whether it was him or his agent, whatever it was, he's not in the credits. You watch that movie, Gene Hackman's name does not appear anywhere. It doesn't appear in the opening credits, and it does not appear in the closing credits. The phrase they use in the movie business is that Gene Hackman went unbilled. But he's still really strong. Character's name is Avery Tolar, another interesting name, Avery Tolar. Now, my favorite Gene Hackman film of the decade of the 90s, just in terms of the kind of entertainment factor, is another movie where he's a primary character, but he's not the primary character. And that is Barry Sonnenfeld's adaptation of Elmore Leonard's terrific sort of comic crime novel, Get Shorty. Now, in a similar vein to people saying that the movie Charade by Stanley Donen, the guy who also did Singin' in the Rain, but Charade with Cary Grant, a thriller, a terrific, incredible thriller to me, with Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn, George Kennedy, the same George Kennedy I mentioned earlier, Walter Matthau, is often jokingly referred to as the best Hitchcock film that Hitchcock didn't make. Get Shorty, to me, is the best Tarantino film that was not directed by Tarantino. There are so many parallels in terms of the shot construction, the out-of-nowhere graphic violence that you're not expecting, and the really strong, and Travolta, who had just made Pulp Fiction, but the really strong performances in supporting roles that you don't expect. Hackman's a given. That when you give Gene Hackman a juicy role, like he plays this kind of shitty movie producer who gets involved in this wacky scheme that John Travolta is going to try to leverage his position as essentially a strong arm for a mob boss in Miami, and somehow he's going to get involved in the movie business, and Gene Hackman, as this crappy producer, gets involved, and Danny DeVito gets involved. He's playing a movie star similar to what he would be in real life. And James Gandolfini, the late, great James Gandolfini, in it, what should have been a complete throwaway role, is unbelievable as Bear. He doesn't really have any scenes with Hackman, but he has a bunch of scenes with Travolta. That movie is so good. It is so entertaining. Delroy Lindo, another actor who made a ton of big movies in the 90s and is still active. Everything is great. It's funny. It has the action. It has thriller elements and these kind of sudden outbursts of violence. It doesn't just have to be gunplay or, in a Tarantino film, I shot Marvin in the face, but moments you're not expecting. Just graphic violence. Boom. Crazy. And Hackman is on the poster. It's one of my favorite movie posters. And it's Travolta and Danny and Rene Russo and Hackman looking unlike any other movie that he was ever in. He's got a beard. He's got sunglasses. And Gene's like wearing a kind of thin sweater, just crossing his arms like he's the coolest cat. The coolest cat known to man. And in that movie, his character is not really that cool. Oh, and Dennis Farina. Dennis Farina played one of the great villains in cinema in the 1988 film Midnight Run, starring the late Charles Grodin and Mr. De Niro. His character in Get Shorty is similar to Jimmy Serrano, Midnight Run. It's not quite as horrible as Jimmy Serrano because there is a slight comedic element to his character in Get Shorty. Ray Bones or Ray Barboni, great names. But the character, it's in the ballpark. And again, Dennis Farina, who also has passed, he really nails it. He's really good. And he has a scene with Hackman that I still laugh about to this day. Hackman's character spends part of the movie looking a little like Jack Nicholson in Chinatown with his nose all fucked up. But the last movie, other than Runaway Jury, but the last movie of Gene Hackman's career that I want to talk about and kind of highlight for film fans who maybe don't know that or the other film that I'm going to bring up. Because Hackman has had such an incredible, long, and varied career. Just from Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 until Welcome to Mooseport in 2004. So you're talking about 37 years where he was active. He's no Clint Eastwood, right? Clint Eastwood's still making movies in 2024, although not starring. It's probable that Cry Macho will be his last film that he appeared in, but Clint was starring in movies for like 60 years almost. Like, what the fuck? But 1998 with Will Smith, another one of my dad's favorite movies. And Dad always liked Will Smith, and he always liked Gene Hackman, but he didn't specifically seek out movies from either of them. He enjoyed Independence Day. He liked 6 Degrees of Separation. But he was not, strictly speaking, I've got to see it because it's Will Smith. Will was a big star, and Dad really liked I Am Legend. I feel like that was his favorite Will Smith film because Will was doing something a little different. But Enemy of the State, and there's a reason why I'm going to end on this. The character that Gene plays, he plays a guy whose name is either Brill or Edward Lyle. I'm not really sure if his real name was Brill or if his real name was Edward Lyle, and it doesn't matter because Gene in Enemy of the State is a paranoid surveillance expert who was sort of a government expat, or he worked for the government, and he's incredibly paranoid, and he, as much as possible, tries to live off the grid. Will's character gains some information that he shouldn't have. Jason Lee gives him something. It's very complicated. It's not really that complicated when you watch the movie, but Will gets something in his possession. He's an attorney, a DC attorney, and a Harvard grad, like very, very intelligent. It was a role that was originally written for Gibson, Cruise, Willis, Stallone. It was written as an older white actor, and Will ended up playing it. He plays the hell out of it. And I'm glad the movie ended up going to him because I don't think it works as well with those. And I love all those guys, Costner. I feel like it works better that Will is the age that he was 30-ish when the movie was made, and his character's going through some marital issues. And Lisa Bonet, also from Angel Heart, is terrific as a contact of his who kind of gets him with Gene. And Hackman's character in this movie is so angry all the time. He's pissed off. Why'd you blow up your house? Because you made a phone call. The movie works. It's a thriller. It's a thriller that actually predicted, it was a very predictive film, as in another 1998 classic, The Truman Show, which predicted the future of reality TV kind of taking over everything. And us wanting to see other people's lives 100% of the time. Hey, don't pull the curtains down. We want to watch you have sex too. No, we can watch you take a shit. No worries. Enemy of the State is predicting where GPS knows where we are 100% of the time. Whether or not we have a cell phone. They know where we are. Whoever they is, they know where we are. And, the tagline for Enemy of the State is, it's not paranoia if they really are after you. But Gene Hackman's character in the movie Enemy of the State, one of the best fan theories, cinema fan theories ever, that is the same character that Gene played in what many people consider his finest film performance. Francis Coppola's 1974 mega classic, which I may add is available on Netflix as we speak, The Conversation. A rare movie where Harrison Ford, a young Harrison Ford, plays kind of a villainous character. He's not really a villain. And I don't really want to say more because that's a movie, The Conversation, that does not develop anywhere, anyhow, the way that you expect it to. The setup and the payoff are like this. They're not even in the same ballpark, same universe, nothing. But Hackman, in The Conversation, plays a what? What did I say he played in Enemy of the State, a paranoid surveillance expert? In The Conversation, he is even more paranoid surveillance expert, a much quieter man. But I accept the fan theory that he's playing the same character in both movies. And in The Conversation, he's playing the best wiretapper, the best, named Harry Call. Quiet man, he has money, he lives a very small life, does not want anybody to know any of his business at any time, but he is an incredible wiretapper. And in that movie, Gene's character early on is tasked with capturing a conversation in a crowded park, hundreds of people, tons of noise all over the place. That's why these young people are having a conversation in a park, so nobody can know what they're talking about. And Gene figures out how to do it. Microphone here, microphone there, microphone there. And 4 Confederates walking around various positions in the park to capture this conversation. And then Gene, the more he starts thinking about the conversation these two kids are having, the more he becomes convinced whoever hired me to make this recording is going to kill them. And then the movie goes from there. But Gene's performance in the conversation, there's a lot of close-ups. There's a lot of moments where he simply holds the camera with his eyes, and the way that his character moves, the fear that he registers, and the guilt that his character is racked with. And he sells it all. And it's the movie that Francis Coppola made in between Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. I don't know exactly what date it came out, but I believe it was released just before Godfather 2. But it is, when we think of Hackman in the 90s, he gave a lot of broad performances, like Unforgiven, and like another movie that my father loved, and I'm a huge fan of, Absolute Power, the adaptation of David Baldacci's best-selling novel, where Gene plays the President of the United States. And it is a boisterous, loud, a rare performance where he's all but saying, look, check me out, look at me, because his character is really not a nice guy. He's pretty much an awful human being. But it works for the role, the way that he plays that character. It's another authentic performance. But yeah, Harry Call in the conversation, Brill Edward Lyle in Enemy of the State 24 years later. I say it's the same guy. And to support the fan theory a little bit further, Gene wore the same glasses in Enemy of the State that he wears in the conversation. And during Enemy of the State, when the kind of government minions who are working for John Voight, another guy who just was chewing scenery in so many movies in the 90s, from The Rainmaker, Anaconda, Heat with Mr. De Niro and Pacino again. When they are looking up Gene's character and they have a big dossier on screen, like a big computer board where you have a big picture of Gene, the picture is from the movie The Conversation. What do we say? There are no coincidences. Harry Call is Edward Lyle. The character in The Conversation becomes the character in Enemy of the State with Will Smith. And Gene gets to deliver, again, one of my favorite lines in any movie that he says to Will. It's like he was predicting the Oscar slap. Late in the movie, Will has told him of his plan, how they're going to get themselves unfucked, basically, because it looks like they're both screwed. They're going to both die. And Gene says to Will, "You're either incredibly smart or incredibly stupid." And Will goes, "We'll see in a minute." And with that, we have reached the end of episode 73 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this Tuesday evening in New York. If you've checked out this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoyed it, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. Or if you've caught the episode in the audio formats, such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 74 real soon. Until then, take care. Peace out.